Nobody tells you what it feels like when the phone stops ringing. Not the books, not the counselors, not the well-meaning neighbors who bring casseroles and then quietly disappear themselves. Nobody prepares you for the particular kind of silence that settles into a house when the people you gave your entire life to simply stop calling. My name is Eleanor. I am 91 years old. And I want to tell you about the 3 years that changed everything I thought I understood about love, family, and what it means to finally, truly belong to yourself. I want to start somewhere that might surprise you. I want to start not with sadness, but with a Tuesday morning in October, about 8 months ago. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold because I forgot about it, which happens more than I care to admit these days. The garden outside the window was doing what English gardens do in October, going quietly golden and a little bit ragged at the edges, and I sat there looking at it, and I thought, I am all right. Not pretending. Not performing contentment for nobody in particular. I genuinely, in that moment, was all right. And I remember thinking, how on earth did I get here? Because 3 years ago I would not have believed that was possible. So let me take you back. Let me take you back to where this really started, because it did not start 3 years ago. That is just when I finally had to face something that had been building for a very long time. I had 3 children. I say had, not because any of them have passed. They are all alive and living their lives, but because the version of that relationship I carried inside me for most of my life, that version is gone. I have 3 children. David, who is 63 now and lives in Edinburgh with his wife and 2 grown grandchildren I have met perhaps 4 times. Susan, who is 59, and moved to Canada in 2009 and calls at Christmas if the time zones cooperate. And then there is James. James, who lives 40 minutes from this house. 40 minutes, and who I have not spoken to properly. Not a real conversation, not a cups of tea, and tell me how you are conversation, in 3 years and 4 months. I have counted. I am not proud of that, but I have counted. When you are my age, people expect you to be philosophical about these things. They expect you to say something graceful about how children grow up and live their own lives, and that is how it should be. And I do believe that. I genuinely do. Children are not possessions. They are not obligated to orbit around you for the rest of your life simply because you raised them. I know that. I knew that, even in the worst of it. But knowing something in your mind and feeling it settle peacefully in your chest are 2 very different things. And for a long time, those 2 things were very far apart for me. My husband Gerald died in 2019. 11 days before Christmas, which I mention not for dramatic effect, but because it meant that the first Christmas without him was also a Christmas spent in the particular fog of new grief. And my children each had their own families and their own plans, and I told all 3 of them, please do not rearrange everything for me. I will be fine. Go and be with your families. And they did. And I sat in this house with a small chicken I had bought because I could not bring myself to buy a whole turkey for 1 person. And I was fine. I was genuinely fine that day. But something shifted in me. Something that I did not recognize at the time but can see very clearly now. I had spent 54 years being someone's wife. I had spent the better part of 6 decades being someone's mother. And those 2 things had been so central to who I was, so completely woven into the fabric of my daily existence, that when Gerald died and the children did not come, I suddenly found myself in a house with a small chicken and absolutely no idea who Eleanor was without those roles attached to her. That sounds like the beginning of a self-discovery story, and I suppose in the end it is, but it did not feel that way for a long time. For a long time it just felt like grief, and then a particular kind of loneliness that I think is unique to old age, which is the loneliness that comes not from having no one around, but from feeling that the people who should see you no longer quite look at you. David rang every few weeks in 2020. Susan rang at Christmas and my birthday. And James, who was 40 minutes away, James came once in February of that year, stayed for 2 hours, spent most of it on his phone, said he would come back soon, and then did not. Not for months. And when I called him, the calls were friendly enough, perfectly pleasant, but short. Always short. He had things on. He was busy. The children were at various complicated stages of their own lives. His wife had her family commitments. There was always a reason. There was never a reason that was about me. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling this story to make my children sound like villains. They are not villains. They are ordinary people, living ordinary lives, doing what most people do, which is focusing on what is immediately in front of them. I am not immediately in front of any of them. I am a voice on the phone, an obligation that sits in the background of their lives, something they mean to get to and often do not. I understand that. But understanding it did not stop the particular ache of sitting by this phone waiting for it to ring. I did wait. I am almost embarrassed to tell you how much I waited. I would plan my day around the possibility of a call. I would not go out on Sunday afternoons, because Sunday felt like the kind of day someone might ring. I kept my phone charged to 100% at all times, which I never used to bother with before. I rehearsed conversations in my head, thought about what I would tell them, funny things that had happened in the garden, or something I had read, or a memory that surfaced. I had all these things ready, all this stored up life, waiting to be shared with someone who was not calling. And there is a particular cruelty to that kind of waiting that I think is very hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it, because it is not dramatic. It is not a single terrible moment. It is just this slow and very quiet erosion. Every day the phone does not ring is just another ordinary day. And yet, they accumulate. They pile up. And after enough of them, you start to do something that I think is one of the saddest things a person can do. You start to rearrange your own memory of who your children are in order to make sense of their absence. I started telling myself stories. David was under pressure at work. Susan was far away, and time zones were genuinely difficult. James, well, James had always been the complicated one. Ever since he was a teenager, you could never quite read what was going on with James. I made excuses for each of them that I think were really excuses I was making for myself, because the alternative, sitting with the plain, unadorned truth that my children did not prioritize me, that the love was real but the presence was not, that truth was one I was not yet ready to hold. The moment I remember most clearly, the moment I return to when I think about when things actually began to change inside me, was an ordinary Wednesday in January, about 2.5 years ago now. I had fallen. Nothing serious. I tripped over the edge of the rug in the hallway, came down on my hands and knee, frightened myself more than I hurt myself. But I was on the floor for a few minutes, and my heart was going rather fast, and I thought, if this had been worse, if I were hurt, no one would know. Not for hours, possibly not until the next day, because no one was expecting to hear from me. No one was tracking whether Eleanor was all right. I lay there on the hallway floor for a moment after I got myself sorted, and I thought very clearly, this is the situation. This is the actual, honest, unvarnished situation. I am 90 years old. I live alone, and not one of my 3 children would know if something happened to me tonight. And I had a choice in that moment. I could pick up the phone and call James, 40 minutes away, and tell him what had happened. And I knew he would come. I knew he would be worried and kind and full of promises to do better. And then things would go back to exactly as they were within a fortnight. Or I could lie there for another moment and just let the truth of my situation be what it was. Just look at it, without softening it or shrinking it or racing to fix it. I chose the second thing. I am not sure why. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe something in me had finally had enough of the managing and the excusing and the quiet hoping. But I lay on that hallway floor and I looked at the ceiling and I thought, right then, this is where I am. Now what are you going to do with it, Eleanor? That was not a dramatic turning point. Please do not imagine it as one of those cinematic moments where everything suddenly becomes clear. It was not like that. What followed was months of very slow and very unglamorous adjustment. It involved quite a lot of crying, some of which I did in the garden because outdoors crying feels more dignified than crying at the kitchen table for reasons I cannot fully explain. It involved ringing Susan and having a conversation I had been avoiding for 2 years. Not a confrontation. I did not want a confrontation. Just an honest conversation where I told her that I missed her and that the distance was hard. And she cried a little and said she missed me too. And things were slightly better between us for a while after that. It involved writing a letter to James that I never sent, but the writing of it was important, getting all of it out of my head and onto paper where I could actually see it. And it involved, slowly, incrementally, starting to build a life that did not have a space in the middle of it where my children were supposed to be. That sounds bleaker than it was. Or rather, it was bleak to start with, and then it became something else. Because when you stop organizing your inner life around waiting for people who are not coming, you suddenly have a great deal of space. And what you do with that space turns out to matter enormously. I joined a reading group at the library. I had been meaning to do it for years and had not, because Gerald had not been interested. And then, after he died, I told myself I was too old. And then I went and discovered that half the women there were older than me. I started keeping a proper journal, not a diary, a journal, writing down not what I did each day, but what I thought and what I noticed and what I remembered. I have 6 full notebooks now, and I consider them among the most valuable things in this house. I began talking to my neighbour Patricia more, a woman I had been pleasantly polite to for 15 years without ever really knowing, and she turned out to be fascinating. She had lived in 3 countries and worked as a translator and had opinions about everything, and we have become genuinely close in a way I did not expect and am very grateful for. None of these things replaced my children. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is a version of this kind of story that ends with a neat lesson about how you find your real family in community, and strangers become closer than blood, and all of that. My experience was not quite so tidy. I still love my children. I still feel, when I am honest, the particular grief of that distance. Susan and I talk more regularly now, and that is good. David sent a long email last spring that was the most honest communication we have had in years. James and I are still complicated, and I have had to accept that we may remain so. But what has changed? What changed so fundamentally that I barely recognize the woman who lay on that hallway floor looking at the ceiling? Is that my sense of whether I am all right is no longer dependent on whether they call. That is what I learned. That is the thing that took me until 91 years old to understand in my bones rather than just in my head. You are not made whole by the people who love you, even the people who love you imperfectly, or from a distance, or in ways that do not always reach you. You were whole before them. The wholeness was always yours. They added to it, enriched it. Yes, Gerald enriched it immeasurably. My children enriched it in ways I cannot begin to count, but they did not create it. And they cannot take it away, not even by being absent, not even by being too busy, not even by being 40 minutes down the road and not coming. I am 91 years old, and I live alone, and my children do not call as often as I would like. It is the plain truth of my life. And on a Tuesday morning in October, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of cold tea and looked at my October garden, and I was all right. Genuinely, deeply, quietly, all right. Not because anything had been fixed, not because the loneliness had disappeared completely. It had not. But because I had finally stopped needing the phone to ring in order to feel that my life was worth living. If you are younger than me, and I imagine most of you are, I would say this. Do not wait until you are 91 to learn it. Do not spend decades quietly arranging your sense of yourself around other people's capacity to show up for you, even people you love deeply and who love you back. Build something that is yours, a life that is genuinely yours, with your own thoughts and your own friendships and your own small daily rituals that give you pleasure regardless of who calls and who does not. The phone might ring tomorrow. James might drive 40 minutes down the road and knock on that door. And we might sit in the kitchen and finally say all the things that have been waiting to be said. I hope that happens. I would welcome it with everything I have. But my happiness is no longer waiting in that particular room. And that, after 91 years, feels like the most important thing I have ever learned.